Hey everyone, welcome to our lecture on religion in America. And today we're going to be talking about the Great Awakening, the period prior to the Great Awakening, some of the causes that led to the Great Awakening, and what did the Great Awakening do for America and how it set up America being really ready for the revolution on a religious scale, but also help establish the American churches for the emergence of the new republic that would come up. So we're going to be focusing at the beginning some early parts about the Great Awakening, but then we will transition towards uh, religion during the American Revolution. What kind of role did it play leading up to it? During the revolution as well as after the revolution, with the United States creating a republic, that religion played a certain key aspect with the beginnings of the Constitution and eventually the Bill of Rights. And then today we'll end our lecture talking about kind of America's greatest contribution to the field of religion or to religion itself. And we'll talk about that, of what I call always kind of considered America's really invention to religion. So let's kind of begin. Let's get started here with our lecture today. And so, what we want to talk about first, prior to the Great Awakening, we need to talk about the rise and fall of Puritanism here in America. So, commonly among many American scholars or American religious scholars, they will typically say, and you'll see probably throughout your reading of Corrigan, America has maintained for a very long time, even till this day, a stream or a seam of Puritanism. It's part of our DNA of who America is, why America tends to be a little more conservative, why America tends to be, on average, a little more religious than other institutions, other similar countries like Canada or, pretty much all of Europe, why America still remains quite different. And it's because of this Puritanism that is much within our DNA. But however, even though Puritanism doesn't exist anymore as a American religious denomination, it still exists in much of our religious makeup as well as really our fabric as a society. So we do need to talk about the Puritans. Puritanism is very important for understanding America historically as well as religiously. So for the Puritans, if you kind of recall from our previous lecture where we talked about America's baggage being European history, Puritanism emerged out of the dissatisfaction that arose during the English Reformation. So, if you recall, if you remember, we talked about the Protestant Reformation, and we talked about great figures like Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, and so many others that emerged. But typically, for the Continental Reformation or the European Reformation, it was always signified or led by an individual, aka in Germany with Martin Luther, in Geneva, Geneva, Switzerland, and also parts of France, John Calvin, or in Zurich, Switzerland, we had Ulrich Zwingli. And the list goes on and on. I mean, I can hit every single European country and I can identify one singularity, one specific religious leader who helped lead the movement of Protestant Reformationism. However, when we get to England, if you recall, with England, it's something quite different in that there wasn't this Martin Luther like figure, there was no John Calvin. Instead, the Reformation was instituted by the state, meaning that the Reformation was state sponsored. So therefore, it was quite different from that in Germany, that in France, the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries, Central Europe. where the Protestant Reformation took off. In England, it just was it was quite different. It had started from the monarch, more or less. And so, because of that, because of it being state sponsored, typically state and government responses to crisis do not tend to be uh, they tend to be moderate in their response. And so, of course, moderation always tends to lead towards greater significance of dissatisfaction among people. You have people on the right or on the left that figure the Reformation didn't go far enough, some that think that the Reformation went too far. And so that's one of the problems with a moderate approach. And so, thus, Puritanism emerged out of those who were dissatisfied with the English Reformation, feeling that it didn't go far enough. And so, really, from Henry VIII, but not so much, it was more his son, Edward VI, and Elizabeth, we see that Puritans consistently over time in English history emerged out of a movement of these groups of people who felt that the Church of England was still too Catholic in its makeup, too Catholic in what they would call its tapestries, in its appearances. So, for example, if you ever attend an Anglican church or here in America, an Episcopal church, and then you go to a Catholic church, the parallels are quite striking. The Mass is typically performed in the very same way, Mass being the church service, the Sunday church service in a Catholic church or in a Episcopal Anglican church, that where at the Mass, the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper or communion, how most Protestants refer to it, is routinely practiced every Sunday, and where the Eucharist is blessed over and presided by a priest who gives a liturgy that is very standardized. Everything about the service is very standardized, and so again, if you go to an Episcopal church here in America, Anglican church in England, and then the very next Sunday you go to a Roman Catholic church, you will be hard pressed to try to find the differences. They're very similar, even though their theology is quite different. In practice of what you see in a typical worship service is very much the same. Even the aesthetics, meaning the appearances, the images, the cross, everything, the vestibles of the priesthood are very much the same. And so you had a lot of Reformationists were dissatisfied and felt that the English church hadn't gone far enough. So thus emerged a group of dissenters or separatists who were known as Puritans. They wanted to, quote unquote, purify the Church of England, purify it of its Catholic tapestries. And so the Puritans were quite different from most of the separatist movement or most of the Protestant groups that we see coming out of England, in that the Puritans were hyper Calvinists. So if you remember John Calvin was famous for advocating a Presbyterian, which or an elder-led church government, which in terms of political theory is really republicanism, having an elected group from among you who represent everyone else. So it's not purely a democratic where everyone has a vote, but rather a hierarchy within the group who is elected from out the group who rule over the church. And hyper Calvinists also being the Protestant work ethic, the seeing that daily tasks and daily duties were to be seen as callings from God, and so thus, if you're called to be a ditch digger, you are to be the best ditch digger there ever was. If you were called to be a servant in the kitchen, well, you were to be the best damn servant there ever was, because this was an act of worshiping God through service. But more so with the phrase hyper Calvinist, it really applies to that latter part that we talked about from John Calvin and that acronym that we talked about of TULIP. So if you recall what TULIP stands for, the T comes from the phrase total depravity, the idea that man is inherently from his birth inherently sinful, that there is nothing inherently good about man, that man is a corruptible being of the worst kind, and thus man is unable from birth to save himself, that man needs a divine rescuer, needs a savior like figure. You from Tulip, you means unconditional election, and that you, as a sinner, because you are totally depraved as an individual, you have no such thing as choice in the matter of salvation. Salvation doesn't come from your own willingness to believe, your own mind, because again, your personal will, your mind is totally corrupt among hyper Calvinist ideas. So, thus, God chooses you, God elects you. And so you had you for unconditional election. God is the one who chooses you. You have no choice in the matter. You think you do, but that's actually the illusion of free will. L for tulip. L stands for limited atonement. And so this is a big part where a big difference with a lot of denomination or Protestant denominations, in that limited atonement is belief that Christ only died for a few. So this goes back logically to unconditional election, that God chooses a few to be saved. And so that's Christ, when he died on the cross, according to Christian and Calvinist teachings, he died for only a limited few. He didn't die for the entire world, but he died for those who would be later predestined by God to believe. And so Christ's death did not cover everybody, but covered an elected few, a very small few. And so that's why many, later on when we get to slavery, why many white evangelicals can condemn African slaves because of this limited atonement belief and this unconditional election, that God does not save the Negro. God cannot save the Negro because of his own immoral failings, but only God can save the white man. And so that's why Christianity was prevented for some stages to African Americans, but then later that denomination would change because of an introduction of another system of thought, in which we will talk about. So that was L. I, irresistible grace. Because of this unconditional election, that you have no choice, therefore God's grace is irresistible. Thus, you have no choice in being saved. God saves you. And then P is priesthood, the believer, basically once saved, always saved kind of idea. Well, not priesthood believer, but P is for perseverance of the saints. Yeah, exactly. So it's once saved, always saved idea, so that you can never lose your salvation because, again, you have no choice in the matter. So these were hyper Calvinists. So they took everything part of Calvinism, which is pretty hyper in itself, and they cranked it to 11. They cranked it all the way to the max, to where therefore many Puritans were thus persecuted people because they tended to drive people away. They typically were very much an annoyance on society because of their strong, very strong beliefs. Also, they were strong proponents of, within Calvinist theology and Christian theology, what is known as covenant theology. And so, a covenant comes from the Hebrew word berit, which means same thing, covenant, or really the literal more translation from the Hebrew berit is to cut. So it kind of refers to a contract, that you cut a deal, that type of idea, but also later of animal sacrifices. And so that ideology plays into this, and that part of this hyper Calvinism, that you are a totally depraved individual, that you are needing the irresistible grace of God and the unconditional election of God for your salvation. Thus, you have this inherent contract with God that you are to dedicate your life to serving Him unconditionally. That even if it was at the cost of your own family, you do so because of this, again, this unconditional election. So they had this kind of covenant or contract view of God and their relationship to God. But for America, we see that starts to trickle down on a political scale. Therefore, we get to the contract between us and the federal government, the contract between us and the state or local government. That we have this inherent contract within them that they are there, they exist. The local, state, federal government exists in order to serve us, and vice versa. So this kind of contract language that comes pretty throughout the United States history and ideology. But for the Puritans, hope kind of emerged with the coronation of James the First of Scotland. Both Henry, well, really disregard Henry, but both Edward the Sixth and Elizabeth the First, these Tudor kings, they tended to favor moderation. They tended to want to appease both the Catholic population within their society, within the England, and then also kind of always advocated for moderate way or the middle way path in any type of negotiations. However, because Elizabeth died without an heir, the throne of England passed to the next of kin, which was Henry VIII's sister, Mary, who married James V in Scotland. And so, um, they both had a daughter, Mary of Guise, who later becomes Queen Mary of Scotland. And then she had a son who was James VI in Scotland, but becomes James I in England. So the throne passes to James. Well, in Scotland, why the Puritans had a lot of hope is because in Scotland, the Scottish Reformation was completely different from that of the British or the English Reformation in that it wasn't state sponsored. It did have a singularity. It had a leader in John Knox, who was a student of Calvin. John Calvin actually traveled to Geneva for a period of time, studied under John Calvin his theology, his system of government, and brought that system back to Scotland. And so, thus, really, it was John Knox and some fellow, ministers in Scotland who created a new form of denomination within the Protestant movement known as Presbyterianism. So the Presbyterian Church here in America has its roots from the Scottish Reformation. It is Scottish in its origin and its construction, and thus the Church of Scotland versus, unlike the Church of England, was Presbyterian, was very much a child of the Reformation more so than the Church of England. And so there was hope because James the First was Presbyterian. He was raised in Presbyterian ideology and thinking, and many of the Puritans wanted Presbyterian forms of church services as well as state government to trickle its way down into England. So there was hope, initial hope for many of the Puritans with the coronation of James, but however, they didn't do their research. James actually liked a lot of the elements of the Church of England. He liked Anglicanism because Anglicanism gave strong authority to the crown, where versus in Scotland, the crown was very much subjugated to Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, because of the history of Queen Mary, who, not the Bloody Mary, but Queen Mary of Scotland, who, even though she was very much Catholic, she tried to rule Scotland with absolute authority. And so the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Church set about stripping much of its power from the monarchy. So when James came to the throne in England, England was the opposite at the time. in which the monarchy had significant power, and James wanted to find ways to strengthen the absolute monarchy idea, and so thus used the Church of England for that purpose, and thus helped spread the Church of England into Scotland and even more so into Ireland. So the Puritans who had this hope with King James were wildly, as I say here, wildly disappointed. However, there was one bright spot very early in James' reign over the United Kingdom at that time. It was King James that wisely created a new Bible, an English translation that appealed to many of the Puritans and dissenters and separatist movements within England. And so, thus, we have by 1611 the creation of the famous King James Bible. And so that was one huge bright spot for the separatist and Puritan and dissenters movement within England. However, they were still wildly disappointed with King James. But things took a turn for the Puritans when leading up to the events of the English Civil War. So after James, we already kind of mentioned it, James wanted to create an absolute monarchy. He was very much a believer in the divine rights of king. James's little history doesn't really talk about this much, but James was actually an accomplished theologian, that he wrote many books on theology, particularly the theology of kings and their divine right to rule. And so James's son, Charles the First, followed in his father's footsteps and wanted to pursue it to an even more so, which caused a lot of problems, would eventually lead to the English Civil War between those in the Parliament who wanted to limit the power of the king, and then too, because also Charles became Catholic because of his wife, and so Catholics and Protestants now were fighting each other again in England, and so eventually the English Civil War emerged, with ultimately it slowly being ended with the execution of Charles the First in 1649. And so this is, yes, in English history, this is the this is the only time that England had ever executed their own king. And so you have the English Civil War with parliamentarians fighting loyalists, with Protestants fighting Catholics, and then you have the period of the interregnum, which is a Latin phrase for in between, regnum, kings, so in between the kings, because after the execution of Charles the First, England was no longer a monarchy. For a very short period of time, from 1649 to 1660, England was a commonwealth, being ruled by Parliament and being ruled by an elected dictator, really, in the Lord Protectorate Oliver Cromwell, who really acted like a dictator and forced his rule, his view of life upon England and English societies. So when I say things took a turn for the Puritans, because Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan himself. Much of the parliamentarian leaders during the Civil War and prior to the Civil War were Puritans as well, that they had gained entrance into Parliament and thus started to cause a lot of chaos. And so the Puritans had moments of success within England because of Oliver Cromwell's rule. However, Puritans shortly became disappointed because Oliver Cromwell, instead of enacting so many things that Puritans thought he would do, he started to become more and more like a monarch and started to rule like a dictator, an absolute. So eventually, once Oliver Cromwell died, I think it's 1658, 1659, when he died, his son Richard took over and was very relatively weak. Parliament had changed, meaning the Puritans were kicked out of Parliament because of them just causing problems. and eventually the Parliament invited the king or the monarchy back and invited Charles II, who's the son of Charles I, back to England to become crowned king again. And so we have the establishment of the constitutional monarchy once again in England. And so Puritanism took a nosedive after this period in England. And other things happened also that seemed to squash Puritan gains within England. So shortly after the coronation of Charles II and of the monarchy once again, Charles II quickly passed what is known as the Act of Uniformity in 1662, which basically reversed all Puritan gains within English society, all dissenters' gains within English society. And so basically, it really said that all of what Oliver Cromwell did, because he tried to remove certain of the Catholic tapestries within the Church of England, got rid of many of the bishops and made the Church of England more of a Presbyterian style form of government, and that it had elected leaders instead of bishops who were appointed and appointed for life, things like that. The Act of Uniformity reversed everything. It basically said that Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans' efforts really didn't exist anymore, that we're going all the way back to the period of time within 1640s, the early 1640s. So all of these things just never happened again. And thus, the Puritans were now seen as outsiders once again. All the dissenters and separatist groups within Protestantism in England were all seen as outsiders once again. And so the reestablishment of the Church of England as Anglicanism was what the purpose of that act was. And then the final death nail came with the Act of Toleration in 1689, where again this is during the Glorious Revolution with William of Orange and his wife Mary come over and dethrone James II. And the Act of Toleration kind of null and void much of the Puritans' claim, because now Act of Toleration was everybody had equal access to to the church, or everyone had equal access to certain rights within Protestantism. And so Puritanism, that had gained significant following because it was always seen as an outsider, now became irrelevant because that wasn't an issue anymore. And so Puritanism really in England started to die out uh, by Queen Anne's monarchy in 1701. Puritanism in England was pretty much dead. However, in America, Puritanism enjoyed a lot of success very early on. And so I have here separatist Puritans because in America, the ones who came to America were also a divided group within the Puritan movement. They were Puritans who decided in England that they could work with the Church of England, that they would stay part of members of the Church of England, but they would advocately try to insist on reform from within. However, there was many Puritans who felt no, that they needed to separate themselves from the Church of England, so they became known as separatists, or sometimes known as dissenters. And so emerged within this Puritan group really two divides: those Puritans who wanted to remain within the Church of England to try to change from within, and those who wanted to separate themselves and start their own church. The ones who came to America were the separatists. So they were the sectarians of the sectarians, if that makes sense. So the sectarians, the separatist Puritans, had a lot of success in America because, in fact, the Church of England wasn't really established much so in the American colonies. And so when they came over to America, they were able to establish the way of life how they wanted to. So the Puritan Pilgrims who came to Massachusetts in 1620, were able to succeed very early and very quickly because there was no competition in Massachusetts. There was only two colonies at that time. There was only the colony at Jamestown, or the Virginia colony, that was very limited to the Jamestown Peninsula there, and Massachusetts. And that was it for a very long time until 1640s, where you had the establishment of Maryland and the Carolinas. So again, separatists enjoyed a lot of success very early on because they could now create society how they wanted to create it. But during the reign of Charles the First, and really with the rule of Oliver Cromwell, Puritanism in America fluctuated because Puritans were going back and forth between England and America, fighting the good cause against Charles the First, or fighting within Oliver Cromwell's wars with Ireland and Scotland in order to create a Puritan style rule. And so Puritanism kind of was in flux during this period. But however, uh, you know, the Puritans kind of once the Oliver Cromwell's rule became well established, and then once many Puritans left to go back to England to live under the Commonwealth, but then they became greatly disappointed, and so many of them started to come back again to America. So you had this back and forth where Americans seemed to be this bastion of Puritanism thinking and ideology. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony during this period, from really 1620 all the way up to the 1700s, really 1720s to some extent, was plagued by a long, long history of religious persecution and religious intolerance. And so we talked a little bit about that with our last lecture with Roger Williams, with the emergence of Baptist groups coming to America in the 1630s. Baptists were among those of the dissenter groups within the English Reformations. Baptists, many of them believed that the Church of England, again, was like the Puritans, was too Catholic in its ideology and its theology. But also, Baptists felt that many of the Protestant groups still hadn't gone far enough. That the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, that it didn't go back all the way to many of the key teachings of the Bible, and one of those being in the way that baptism is done. So for Baptists, Baptists believe and that the ritual of baptism was not something that should be undertaken as a child. For the Church of England and the Church of the Catholic Church and the Presbyterian Church, baptism was seen as a ritual that was done to kind of christen the child, to make a covenant for the parents with God as well as the church with the child and the parents with God, that they would raise this child in a Christian atmosphere, in a Christian home, in a Christian lifestyle, and a Christian education. That baptism was seen as a covenant that the church and the parents make upon the child. Whereas Baptists, they see the act of baptism as a covenant between God and the individual. So thus, for a long time, for all the way up really till the 1950s, Baptists were adamant in that no child can be baptized because a child does not comprehend the act. That the act of baptism must be made when a person has reached adulthood, when a person has understand the nature of the ritual, and that the ritual is to be a confession and to be a covenant between the individual and their God. And so for Baptists, they believed that baptism was something that would be done as an adult and as a sign of true belief. And so thus, because Presbyterians, Anglicans, Catholics at this time did not practice this, many Baptists accused these Christians as not really being Christians because they never had made a public confession of faith, similarly to what Jesus had done from the New Testament. And all the examples that the Bible gives and the New Testament gives are adult baptism. Even Jesus himself, the Gospel of Mark opens up his story about Jesus with Jesus being an adult and seeking out baptism in a very public confession of faith in God, and thus is an act that should be repeated. So these were the Baptist groups, and so thus they are sometimes referred to as dissenters, because they even, thought that many of the separatist groups, like the Puritans, weren't going far enough either. And so they caused a lot of turmoil within England. And so when they came to America, the Puritans wanted to kick them out too. And so the Baptists were a thorn in many Protestant sides for a very long time, up until really really into the 1850s, before Baptists became normalized in America and became one of the largest denominations with Protestant denominations within America, because now they've become, again, normalized. But for a very long time, they were persecuted people. As a Baptist, you couldn't serve in the government. You couldn't serve in local communities. You were often kicked out, isolated, segregated, because they were seen as dissenters. And, too, because of the Baptists' own language and promulgations, they were very outspoken in what they believed. And also, too, like Roger Williams, Baptists believed in complete separation of church and state. And many Baptists, like Roger Williams, advocated that no, the state needed to be purely secularist, because anytime from church history, our Christian history, anytime the Christian movement or the church has grown, it has grown when the government has not been Christian, when the government has been purely secularist. And so for the church in America to grow and to be all that it can be, for Baptists, they believed that the church or the state needed to remain secularist. And so it really was the Baptists, that we'll get to here in a little bit later, who were some of the first to strongly advocate and fight for the First Amendment here in America, and why the United States government tries to maintain a secularist ideology with this approach to religion, and it's because you have to thank the Baptist and their early ideology. But however, that's changed since the 1950s. For Baptists, meaning because Baptists have now kind of abandoned that type of thinking. But anyhow, so the Massachusetts Bay Colony was plagued by long histories of religious persecution like that with the Baptists. And then later on in the 1630s, mid 1630s, Quakers began coming to Boston as well. And so there was a tragic event in, I think, 1635, maybe closer to 1640 if I remember right. But I think it's early, much early in the 1630s. So I say 1635, where many of the Puritans started to persecute many of the Quakers who had arrived into Boston. And at one point, the persecution got so severe that in turn, many of the Puritans actually executed many of the Quakers who had arrived into Boston. And that word of these executions, I think it was 18 Quakers in a period of a year, were publicly executed in the city square of Boston. That word got back to England, and Charles the First actually uh, removed the charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony in punishment of its history and its treatment of British citizens, because of publicly executing somebody because of their religious belief. And so, for a brief time, because of Puritanisms and how radical many of the Puritans were, that Massachusetts, today we think of it as a bastion of liberalism, a bastion of religious tolerance. In fact, the opposite was true for much of its history early on. It was a very intolerant place to live. But eventually, Puritanism in America kind of reached its crescendo with the events surrounding the Salem witch trials from 1692 until 1693. And so I want to show you a quick little video about the Salem witch trials that kind of represent, again, like I said, the crescendo of Puritanism in America.
Our Earth is like a You've been accused of a crime you did not commit. It's impossible to prove your innocence. If you insist that you're innocent anyway, you'll likely be found guilty and executed. But if you confess, apologize, and implicate others for good measure, you'll go free. Do you give a false confession or risk a public hanging? This was the choice facing those accused of witchcraft in the village of Salem, Massachusetts, between February 1692 and May 1693. They were the victims of paranoia about the supernatural, misdirected religious fervor, and a justice system that valued repentance over truth. Salem was settled in 1626 by Puritans, a group of English Protestants. Life was strict and isolated for the people of Salem. Battles with their Native American neighbors and groups of French settlers were commonplace. People feared starvation and disease, and relations between villagers were strained. To make matters worse, 1692 brought one of the coldest winters on record. That winter, two cousins, 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, started behaving very strangely. A physician found nothing physically wrong, but diagnosed the girls as under an evil hand. Puritans believed that the devil wreaked havoc in the world through human agents, or witches, who blighted nature, conjured fiendish apparitions, and tormented children. As news swept through the village, the symptoms appeared to spread. Accounts described 12 so-called afflicted girls contorting their bodies, having fits and complaining of prickling skin. 4 of the girls soon accused 3 local women of tormenting them. All 3 of the accused were considered outsiders in some way. On February 29th, the authorities arrested Sarah Good, a poor pregnant mother of a young daughter, Sarah Osborne, who had long been absent from church and was suing the family of one of her accusers, and Tituba, an enslaved woman in Betty Paris's home known by her first name only. Tituba denied harming the girls at first, but then she confessed to practicing witchcraft on the devil's orders and charged Good and Osborne with having forced her. Osborne and Good both maintained their innocence. Osborne died in prison, while Good's husband turned against her in court, testifying that she was a witch or would be one very quickly. Good's 4-year-old daughter was imprisoned and eventually gave testimony against her mother. Meanwhile, Good gave birth in jail. Her baby died, and she was convicted and hanged shortly thereafter. Tituba was held in custody until May and then released. These 3 victims were just the beginning. As accusations multiplied, others, like Tituba, made false confession to save themselves. The authorities even reportedly told one accused witch that she would be hanged if she did not confess and freed if she did. They were not particularly interested in thoroughly investigating the charges. In keeping with their church's teachings, they preferred that the accused confessed, asked for forgiveness, and promised not to engage in more witchcraft. The court accepted all kinds of dubious evidence, including so-called spectral evidence, in which the girls began raving when supposedly touched by invisible ghosts. Complicating matters further, many of the jurors in the trials were relatives of the accusers, compromising their objectivity. Those who dared to speak out, such as Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall, came under suspicion. By the spring of 1693, over 100 people had been imprisoned, and 14 women and 6 men had been executed. By this time, accusations were starting to spread beyond Salem to neighboring communities, and even the most powerful figures were targets. When his own wife was accused, the governor of Massachusetts colony suspended the trials. Sentences were amended, prisoners released, and arrests stopped. Some have speculated that the girls were suffering from hallucinations caused by fungus, or a condition that caused swelling of the brain. But ultimately, the reason for their behavior is unknown. What we do know is that adults accepted wild accusations by children as hard evidence. Today, the Salem witch trials remain a cautionary tale of the dangers of groupthink and scapegoating and the power of fear to manipulate human perception.
All right. So like I said, the Salem witch trials, as you can kind of see, were very much the crescendo of Puritanism in America. Massachusetts was a bastion of Puritanism, Puritan-style government, Puritan-style forms of thinking, everything. It was a Puritan society at its core. And you can see because Puritanism were very much committed religiously, even fervently, to the point of abandoning their spouses in the name of their religious commitment. You can see where an episode like the Salem witch trials can be taken to its ultimate and worst extremes because of this. And so, really, after the Salem witch trial in Massachusetts, Puritanism began to slowly fade away and began to evolve into a new form of denomination that became known as Congregationalism in Massachusetts. That was a little more moderate, a little more less religious fervor, and Puritanism really died away shortly after the Salem witch trial. But it still exists in much of Americans' thinking and theology today. So there are certain elements, superstition, elements of belief that the devil is constantly in act within this world, behind witchcraft, stuff like that. So Puritanism is still very much a part of America's fabric on a religious scale. But since the Salem witch trial as a denomination, it quickly faded away. So let's talk about, let's get towards the Great Awakening, and let's talk about one of the preludes to the Great Awakening, or really to evangelicalism that kind of dominates America today, and Protestant circles today. And we're going to talk about German Pietism, that ultimately was one of the precursors for the Great Awakening as a movement. So while the Protestant Reformation represented in a simple equation that it emerged because there was great dissatisfaction within the Catholic Church or within European society, German Puritan or Pietism emerged for similar reasons, but it emerged in response to the fanaticalism that grew out of the Protestant Reformation. Because even though the Protestant Reformation wanted to change European society and change the Catholic Church, many of the Protestant churches and denominations simply replaced the Catholic Church in controlling people's lives and controlling the government. And so this similar dichotomy that we're seeing constantly being raised here, this idea of religious unity equals political unity. And so you have to have people all believing one similar faith in order to have political unity, in order to avoid all of the religious wars and troubles that had plagued European society. So even though the Protestant Reformation believed in individualism, the idea of the priesthood of the believer, many of the latter followers of Luther and Calvin wanted to dictate the same way that the Catholic Church dictated belief and doctrine, and who is to be classified truly as a Protestant. And so within many of the Protestant societies and circles, you have other Protestants fighting other Protestants or persecuting other Protestants, because this is not my definition. And so even though Luther's movement was the beginning and the roots of individuality, In Europe, they were still fighting between European Enlightenment ideas that will eventually come out of individualism to back to medieval collectivism. So the German Pietist movement emerged out of a great dissatisfaction, particularly within Germany, but would quickly later spread to the Netherlands and then subsequently to the UK, which will eventually come to America because of dissatisfaction within the Protestant Reformation itself. It had lost its purpose. It lost its true origins and was just devolving into religious fighting and turmoil. So German Pietism emerged as a possible solution to this fighting. So the origins, the direct originator of this movement. Now, people, if they study German Pietism or the Pietist movement within Christian history, there's a lot of originators or a lot of people who emerged behind this movement. But more specifically for me, I think it can be singled down to or distilled down to the writings and the teachings of Philip Spener. Now, Pietism, again, within the Catholic Church or Christian Church or Protestant history, has always been there, has always existed. There's been movements, similar movements of reactions against religious domination and religious persecution. The monastic movement, of monks, nuns, and monastic orders emerged originally out of dissatisfaction with imperial Christianity. Once Christianity became a recognized imperial religion of the Roman Empire, shortly after that led to a series of corruptions, and thus monasticism was a response to this corruption of society that to because now all of European society or world society was oversaturated with Christianity, many people decided that the best response to that was to abandon society and live an ascetic and monk style life or lifestyle. And so that became a response to dissatisfaction with imperial Christianity of the late antiquities of the Roman Empire. Similarly, here as well, we see a reaction to Protestant Reformation that many of the state and national and state governments were getting on board with what the Protestant Reformation was doing, but then in turn were forcing their individuals to believe a certain set of beliefs instead of freedom of conscience, freedom of choice, things that Martin Luther advocated for had been turned to violence instead. So, Philip Spener, I believe, is one of the key moments for this new emergence of German Pietism that would later come to affect us through the Great Awakening. And so he was convinced that the German church, which is the German Lutheran church or Lutheranism that has come to America as well through German and Scandinavian migration, but the German church was corrupt in his lifetime. So really almost 200 years after the death of Luther, Spener is saying already the church in Germany, the Protestant church in Germany, was already corrupt. It had lost its true purpose, and thus the German church already needed a new reformation. 200 years later, it needs a reformation. And so he said, quote, the necessity of a moral and religious reformation needed to happen. What he saw within his own lifetime was that the Christian life, being made up by now these institutionalized Protestant churches, was that the Christian life was being willfully sacrificed to the ideology of zealotry and zeal, rigor for having what he saw in the German church as Lutheran orthodoxy, but when you expand the scope to England and Scotland and even in France and Spain and Italy for the Catholic Church, you saw Christians killing other Christians because of rigid orthodoxy. Back to this original doctrine right here. that in order to have political peace, we gotta have religious unity. So that's in Spain and France and Italy, these countries that were predominantly Catholic. You have the Spanish, or you have the Inquisition that was going on, more famously in Spain, but the Inquisition was also in Italy and in France as well, where Catholics were rooting out Protestants or rooting out Jews or rooting out anybody that they would see as witches or see as non-believers and just killing them in droves. You had, again, the English Civil War, really being fought over religious reasons. And then, the period between Oliver Cromwell that we saw, Protestants fighting other Protestants. Oliver Cromwell had to lead an army into Scotland to fight other Protestants. And you had this terrible goings on because of all over the name of orthodoxy, this simple belief here that to have political unity, you gotta have religious unity. And so Spener was just tired of it. His country was being torn apart, and he saw the church as being a key source of the problem. So most famously in one of his famous books, Pia Desiride, um, Spencer made a proposal to fix Christianity, basically. Six proposal to what he called restoring true Christian living, or restoring the true nature of Christian life that Christ had intended. And so some of these principles actually make their way to the United States and become part of our own religious fabrics. And so really his first and true proposal was probably the biggest of them all. It's this Latin phrase of ecclesiae and ecclesia, that translates, as I have here, little churches within the church. So it's his idea that instead of having institutional control on a state level, like you had in England, the Church of England, in which the monarch is the head of the church, and you have this hierarchical system, the same thing in Germany, that you had this hierarchical system of bishops that controlled everyday life, that instead, what we need and what the Bible actually teaches, according for Spener, sorry, is that a more democratic style of church governance, which would later inflict an American style of democratic style government. Little churches within churches, kind of a federalist approach that you distill down authority to the local level instead of having it being ruled from the top down. You have federalism, which is the opposite of ruling from the bottom up. And so this is a basic idea that he had of we need to make the churches more democratic. And he goes on to say, if there's this idea of a universal priesthood that Martin Luther so advocaatly fought for, that all Protestants basically believe at one stage or another, at one level or another, then the laity, that means those who are not priests, those who are not ministers, the laity, the common people of the church, should run the church and be actively involved in spiritual matters. And so you're going to see this theme over and over again when we get to American controversies within Catholicism. You'll see this over and over and over again, that eventually it will come true later by the Vatican II Council. But this is the idea. And so you can see the same thing comes to America as well, that the laity, the local people, should have a better say in the form of government that they should have and should run the government instead of having this high up hierarchy kind of system. And they should be actively involved within the government matters. Republicanism. That's basically what republicanism meant, to be locally involved in matters. And then so you see this democracy, Republican style form of church governance being distilled that ultimately gets played out here in America. He goes on to say that true Christian knowledge can only be obtained by practice, that it doesn't come from doctrines, it doesn't come from creeds. It doesn't come from vestments and vestibules, but rather from practices, from the individual practice. So this is where piety comes in, that true Christian knowledge, true Christian living involves personal level of piety. Not what do you believe, not if you confess this certain faith, not if you believe in these 16 points, whatever. It's rather your actions. And so that's here in America why many Americans typically don't identify themselves anymore with a specific form of denominations. Why many Americans can go to either a non-denominational church, or at some point in their life they go to a Baptist church and then go to a Presbyterian church and a Methodist church or even a Catholic church. And they'll say the reasons why is because they like the people, they like the practices, they like how they feel, and they don't respond to doctrines necessarily. So you can see some of these ideas get later distilled down into America. Again, because of the violence that was going on in Europe, because of the 30-year wars and the religious wars that would rage on throughout the 17th century, Spener advocated that the Bible and Christianity teaches love over violence in all things. You know, there's this famous episode from the New Testament, from the gospel stories, when the soldiers come to, grab Jesus and kidnap him or take him away in the middle of the night while he's praying in the garden. And you have Jesus, his most beloved disciple, one of his most trusted ones, Peter, take a sword that's hidden from his cloak and cut the ear off of a soldier. And what does Jesus do? Jesus, grabs Peter, and instead of saying, "Yes, Peter, fight on," he scolds Peter and he heals the soldier. And he scolds Peter and says, "Those who live by the sword shall die by the sword." This is not Jesus' revolution. This is not what Christ had come to do. And so you have Protestants fighting Protestants, Catholics and Protestants fighting each other, Christians fighting Christians. Spener was saying this is not what Jesus wanted. This is not what the Bible wants. So you had love over violence. And then a big part here was he advocated for massive forms of reorganizing theological training of ministers instead of being focused so much on correct doctrine, on creeds, instead of caring so much about theology. Rather, they needed to focus more on devotional trainings, more on prayer, more on patience, more on ethics. That slowly will become an evolution within the seminary training of many ministers as well, but it doesn't take initial roots until much, much later. And then he advocated for a different style of preaching instead of, a more, preaching that was more doctrinal sound and more emphasis on doctrines. Instead, that it needed to be focused more on the person, focused more on the inner soul or the inner man of the person. So this last bit is really what helped spur the Great Awakening in America, because a change in style of preaching that focused on the individual versus on the collective. Instead of using, they pronouns, you use, singular pronouns. You use he, she, you kind of pronouns instead. So ultimately, Spener and the German Pietist movement, what they stressed was instead a new form of identity within Christianity. They stressed that the necessity of being a Christian is not so much believing the correct things on doctrines and creeds or making baptisms and stuff like that, public professions of faith. And instead, what it meant to be a Christian was having these quote unquote new birth experiences. And so Spencer would commonly cite, the story of Nicodemus from John's Gospel, chapter 3, where we get, John 3:16, but where you get Jesus talking to Nicodemus, and he tells him, Nicodemus asks, "How can I become a believer?" And Jesus says, "You must be born again." And Nicodemus is confused and says, "How can I, as a grown man, crawl inside my mother's, womb again and to be born again? This doesn't make sense." He misunderstood this kind of spiritual awakening that needed to happen. You needed to have a change. And so it advocated for this new birth kind of experience, advocated for this new spiritual awakening that will lead to true repentance. And thus you became, as Paul says in Corinthians, a new creation in Christ. And so now you have the roots of the Great Awakening. So for the Great Awakening, the term Great Awakening really refers to four significant periods within America, but also in Europe, in England primarily. Really England, America, but specifically for our purposes in America when we say the Great Awakening. That they had four periods of great revivals and religious revivals between the 18th century up to the 20th century. We have these series of revivals that launch for about 20 to 30-year period that dominate Christian culture or American religious cultures for a very long time, but in turn produce a significant results, being these widespread evangelical revivals. So the first Great Awakening is sometimes just simply referred to as the Great Awakening. You can see here this period, this over 25-year period from 1730 to 1755, marked a beginning of this kind of new Anglo-American evangelical style form of Protestantism. So again, it started in England but trickled into America and really took root in America, but had still some significant effects in England. But we're not going to talk about those, but the effects that it had in America. And so for the Great Awakening, it had really five key features of it. So the first key feature was this kind of emotional conversion experience. Typically, again, back to the German pietists prior to it, conversion was seen as a rational thing. That you had a series of propositions, that you believed a certain set of doctrines, and that you confessed these doctrines in a correct order. Typically, conversion in a Christian context took several months, sometimes a year, for a person to be confirmed as being a Christian and being a believer, that they would have to go through a series of educations that were known as catechisms. Many of you are Catholic, might have gone through these, or sometimes Presbyterians still do it to this day. Anglicans do it, where you would have these series of studies that you would do in order to pass them. And then after you pass them, then you would become declared a Christian. This changed dramatically with the First Great Awakening, and that conversion is not some gradual process that after a series of education you become and declare a Christian. Rather, it was immediate, and you had to have an emotional response. And thus the nature of preaching changed in America, where it became preaching that was more compassion, more passion driven, and more of a compelling preaching, that you were trying to convince people to have an emotional response instead. And so it became the new characterization of American style churches, that the goal of going to a Protestant church is to have now a religious response while you go to church. If you don't have an emotional response, then a lot of people say you really didn't go to church. You didn't, go stand and, wave your hands in the air, jump up and down or something like that. Or when there's, the music comes on, if it's not, guitar and I don't feel the spirit leading, I really didn't have an emotional experience. Thus, I didn't really have a church experience. That becomes the new characterization because of the Great Awakening. And so first, one of the key features was an emotional response. You had to have this kind of emotional experience and conversion. Number two, that Corrigan mentions this a lot, but he doesn't mention the other side of the coin, that the Great Awakening did serve for the United States a period of time of uniting many denominations together. Because again, America was very much divided early on in its experience because it was 13 separate colonies. And so, because of their attitudes, as being 13 separate colonies, uh, Protestant denominations within America were often seen in the same light. You were different. If you were Presbyterian, you were different from an Anglican. You were different from a Baptist. You were different from a new religion that would emerge in the Great Awakening, Methodist. You were different from a Quaker. You were different from a um, Mennonite. You were different from a Lutheran. You were different from a Congregationalist. You were all different, and you stayed in your corners. And so religion in America, even at the state levels, stayed within their state boundaries too. The Anglican Church was very prominent within Virginia and North Carolina, in South Carolina, and in New York. Catholicism in America was very prominent in Maryland for a very long time, and started to make waves in Pennsylvania, but it wasn't really found elsewhere. Quakerism was found only really in Delaware and Pennsylvania and a little bit New Jersey, but outside of that, that's about it. Congregationalists were pretty much limited to New England. Baptists were pretty much limited to New England and then later in Virginia, and South Carolina later. But it was very limited. However, for the Great Awakening, they realized that these divides, these doctrinal divides, were pointless. There was much more in common than there was that was separating us. And so, for a spell, the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening, served to unite many of the denominations together, that they saw themselves as American Protestants or American Christians, and they can look beyond their divides, and so thus helped when come time for the Revolution, because there was less and less that started to divide Americans than actually there was less that actually divided them, and so they were able to start connecting themselves more and more together. But Corrigan does not talk about the divide that also the Great Awakening caused. It divided some American denominations within each other. And so the most famous example is between Congregationalists and Presbyterians, known as the Old Light versus New Light debate. And so within the Presbyterian Church and the Congregationalist Church in Massachusetts, this debate was really forefront. And that this is how the old light and new light is how they saw at first the Great Awakening and these emotional responses. The old light represented those who didn't believe in emotional responses in churches, that this was unhealthy practices, that emotional responses were just mere manipulations, and that emotion responses never lead to true responses and rational responses. And versus those of who classify themselves as new light, that this is how Christian experiences should be had. That if you did not have an emotional response, chances were you did not really have a Christian experience. And so you had this divide within Presbyterians and Congregationalists, and that you start having divisions. And so, thus, what you start having is sectarianism being made within the essential American denominations. And so, thus, become really an essential characteristics of American Protestant forms of Christianity. So, for example, if you look at a Baptist church here in America, there's probably over 2,000 different styles of Baptist denominations only here in America. There's Southern Baptist, there's Cooperative Baptist, there's Alliance Baptist, there's Northern Baptist, there's National Baptist, there's Progressive Baptist, there's Primitive Baptist, there's Missionary Baptist. There's all these different forms of Baptist because, again, instead of really uniting American denominations with each other, the Great Awakening having this basic dichotomy of an emotional response versus an irrational response led to sectarianism and led to divides that become essential characteristics later on. And we'll see this this sectarianism continues to grow, and it begins to evolve, whether it is emotional responses, whether it's fundamental responses and beliefs of what makes Christianity, responses to Charles Darwin and evolutionism, modernist movements versus fundamentalist and liberals elements within churches, and then too with the abolitionist movement with in the 1850s, 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, where we'll start seeing divides within American denominations again because of more and more issues. So really the Great Awakening started, even though it helped unite Baptists and Methodists and Episcopals to all start working toward with each other. It's essentially at the exact same time, it led to even more and more divides as well. And you also see that, which is interesting, the Catholic Church here in America, the Lutherans, the Quakers, the Mennonite churches were all left unaffected by the First Great Awakening. So again, it really didn't unite everybody because, the Catholic and the Lutherans and the Quakers and the Mennonites were all left out of the conversation. They were all seen, for most part, as minority groups, significant minority groups that became unrepresented at times and unvalued at certain points in times. But later that will change. But what a key part that the First Great Awakening really did was it also helped to de-establish either what was known as institutional churches, or sometimes the phrase here is established churches in America. So what do I mean by institutional churches or established churches? Basically, it's a fancy definition for churches that were state-sponsored. And so we typically don't think about that here in the United States as churches being state-sponsored, because we have the First Amendment. We have this promise that the federal government is not supposed to take sides in the issue of state government. But however, this is prior to the Revolution. This is prior to the establishment of our great republic. Very early on in American society, there was such things as established churches or institutional churches. So in the Virginia colony, the established church in the Virginia colony was the Anglican Church, or later Episcopal Church. State money, your tax money, went to fund these churches, went to pay these ministers. Even if you didn't go to church, even if you didn't tithe to your local Episcopal church, your money went to pay the salary of that minister, even if you didn't go or not. If you were a Baptist in Virginia, your money went to pay somebody else, pay somebody else's churches. So you were double taxed. You were being triple taxed at sometimes. And let's see, for example, and where else we had established churches? In New York. New York became an established church for the Episcopal Church. In Massachusetts was another place where the established church was at. The Congregational Church, the Congregational denomination churches were the established churches, and thus your tax money, thus everything, societal government was all went to sponsor the local church. And so for the First Great Awakening, this caused a lot of colonies, a lot of people, to start questioning, why are we paying taxes to a church that we don't even go to, or a church that doesn't even serve our needs anymore? And so you have, really starting with the Great Awakening, many of the state colonies started to pass laws preventing the establishment or de-establishing the churches. And so the first really being North Carolina, that tried to de-establish the Episcopal Church in North Carolina, but then England fought back, and then later that happened. But the great one being Pennsylvania, that passed a law, even though it didn't have an established church, they passed a law preventing an established church from ever being put on the books. New York and Virginia were some of and Massachusetts as well, were some of the latter ones that were hardened resistance against this movement. But it started to create this idea of, we need to de-establish, defund these churches in America. And then you had a heightened emphasis upon the spreading of the gospel, regardless of gender, race, and status. So the First Great Awakening helped slowly change the attitude that Puritanisms had towards women and many white Protestant groups had towards African slaves. And so during the First Great Awakening, you had Baptist and Methodist churches who went out and ministered to African slaves for the first time. Slaves that were being denied the ability to be saved or have to go to church or things like that. The Methodist and the Baptist churches took that and spat in its face and went and ministered to the African Americans. And so that's why in American history you have Baptist churches and Methodist churches or the Methodist Episcopal Church and African denominations that are quite popular again because of that, because of this history. And then also you had, again, an elevated status of women among Methodist groups, particularly because of this idea that the gospel needed to be preached to everyone. So you had a change in some denominations within the American church. And so, why, for a very long time, the Methodist Church was always one of the four founding groups, later the Episcopal Church as well, for the Methodist Church leading the cause for women's rights because it has its roots back to the Great Awakening. And then finally, the introduction of Armenian theology to America, and we'll talk about that here with the next slide. But this was a big part of it because Armenian theology will later influence new American religious movements that we'll talk about. So for the Great Awakening, there's some prominent figures. You had the Tennant brothers who ministered during this long period of time. The Dutch Reformed minister, I always have a hard time saying his name, Fray Lugan Hussen, if I remember right, Hussen. And then, of course, most famously, Jonathan Edwards, John and Charles Wesley, who were the founders of the Methodist movement, and then George Whitefield, or sometimes George Whitfield, um, either how you pronounce his name, but George Whitefield as well. These prominent theologians and ministers that get who helped shape the First Great Awakening. All right, so let's get to talk about Jacob Arminius and Arminian theology versus Calvinist theology. So Jacob Arminius was a Dutch minister and theologian who studied under Calvin, but really Calvin's direct successor in Geneva, Theodore Beza. But after studying with Theodore, Jacob Arminius publicly rejected much of Calvin's teachings. He saw it as being harmful, potentially harmful to Christian societies because of its harsh stance and how it deregulated the role of humanity, and it kind of dehumanized um, human existence. And Jacob Arminius wanted to change this. So central to Arminius' teachings and Arminius' theology comes from Paul's book in Romans chapter 7, in which that he argued that man, through the grace of God and through rebirth of salvation, is no longer bonded to sin or under bondage to sin. So thus, therefore, because a man is saved and through the grace of God, man is therefore no longer totally depraved. And so why I bring this up is because eventually we'll get to many of the new religious movements that they'll pick up on this. Because you have a religious experience, your life has been changed. And so thus you're not subjugated to this backwards way of thinking that you're constantly never good enough, that you have no powers within yourself. And so eventually you'll get to people who believe in perfectionism, that will get to the Oneida community or to Christian Science teachings that you can perfect your life here and now. You can perfect your way through prayer to eventually, Scientology later will pick up some of this teachings here from Jacob Arminius. And so you have this idea of human perfectionism being born, that the possibility that life can be perfected and human society can progressively get better. And so we'll see this over and over again in American religious society as well when we get to the social gospel movement, or the gospel of wealth movement with Carnegie, or like I said, the new religious movements with the Oneida community, the Shakers, even Mormonism to some extent, all the way even down to Scientology, have some of its roots within Arminius teaching and theology. So what is Arminianism? So we're going to talk about classical Arminianism. And so why it's so important is because American denominations here are heavily influenced by Arminianism. Some Baptist groups, some Baptists are more Calvinist than others, but then there's some that are more Arminian than others. So Baptists kind of straddle the line. All of Methodism is really attributed to Arminianism and Arminianist thought, Pentecostalism as well, the Churches of Christ, the Adventist groups, and like I say, some new religious movements as well, like Mormonism, uh, Oneida community, Jehovah's Witness, and then later the Scientology movement as well. So what does our classic Arminianism teach? Basically, it's tulip, but a reverse of tulip. So instead of man being totally depraved, Arminians believe that no, man has free will. Because of free will, we are not totally depraved. Man has the ability to choose who to believe in, choose to believe in God. And side to that, that God, because of free will, God has to limit his sovereignty in order for free will to be maintained. So thus, Jacob Arminius believed that God is not as all-powerful as John Calvin would say. John Calvin would have no problem with his theology and his system of saying that God causes evil in the world because it ultimately comes about by his purpose. And so that if somebody dies, there's a cause and effect behind that. And there's some particularly good behind this death, possibly, because God controls everything, so God is all good. So therefore, ultimately, there's a good purpose behind everything. Even if there's a little evil in the world, God allows a little evil in order to do a greater good. Jacob Arminius rejected that and said, no, this is that there's evil in the world, and evil is inherently bad. It's because God purposefully limits his sovereignty in order to allow man to have free will. And so thus a man can be a born again believer and a Christian and then go take a gun and murder somebody. And God allows that because of free will. So there's some inherent problems within that, but that's an ethics debate. We don't need to get into that. Instead of limited atonement, Jacob Arminius believed that atonement is intended for everybody, that Christ died for everybody, and that everybody is and will be saved. That there is no differences between races, there's no differences between Europeans and non-Europeans and everything. Christ died for everybody. And so it's a different change in attitude as well. So thus you have why some Baptist and Methodist groups and Pentecostals are more about missions because again, Christ died for everybody versus Presbyterians and Episcopals that are less concerned about missions because again, they're more Calvinist in their teachings because of limited atonement. For Arminius, because of man's free will, man has the right to deny God. Therefore, election is, God saving you is conditional. It's dependent upon somebody's faith. And so that's why, you have deep acts of pietism that you routinely perform and routinely why you need to go to church and routinely need to have these religious experiences because salvation is dependent upon your faith and dependent upon these experiences. Again, because of free will, grace is resistible. You can reject God. Where Calvinists would say, no, you can't reject God, but if you reject God, that was because God was never going to save you in the beginning. Here, God wants to save you, but you have the ability to reject. And the last thing is God predestines the elect to a glorious future. And so this is a doctrine that gets bring about in Methodism known as the doctrine of regeneration. And why doctrine of regeneration is important is basically the belief that society and human beings can progressively get better. So this is perfectionism. Man can eventually get better and perfect himself in this life. Um, Methodists sometimes say in this life, sometimes will say, well, that they won't be perfected until they die, but they can get towards perfection in this life, but they'll never reach it until they die, then they're perfected. But later, some groups will say, no, perfectionism can happen now. And this is the act of progressivism. And so that will eventually affect the social gospel movement, as we'll see later. This will affect the Oneida community and the Shaker community as well, these utopian style societies of new religious movements that, because at the root of it is this idea of regeneration. Society can progressively get better. All right, so let's move on from Jacob Arminius, and we need to talk about very quickly a counter-religious movement that started prior to the American Revolution, but also was prominent within our American founding fathers as well, with all of this German pietism and counter movement as well of deism. So deism or deism, depending on how you want to pronounce it, deism is basically a religionization of philosophical rationalism or enlightenment style thinking. And it was very much a reaction to the religious wars that had plagued Europe for so very long. Ultimately, what deism is a rejection of revelation, divine revelation as a source of knowledge, because that was always the trump card. That, oh well, same with the so say for the example, the Salem witch trial. There was this divine revelation by these little girls saying that, oh, I can see this spirit, I can see these aberrations, I can see what's going on, and I can make these assumptions. And so they become a source of knowledge because they claim divine revelation, because the Puritan groups believe in divine revelation, and therefore they tended to believe these little girls. But rather, you can see again, deism says no, true source of knowledge comes from reason, comes from observation of the natural world, and are sufficient in our revealing of truth. Therefore, there is no such thing as divine revelation. There's only what is in front of us. And thus we know demons don't exist because they don't exist in front of us. There's no such things as spirits because no one has ever seen a spirit. And so thus it rejects a lot of divine revelation. So you can see again why it's sometimes a counter movement between over religious zealous or sometimes some of the religious wars that's going on. Deism was very heavily influenced by a Newtonian cosmology. So this is Sir Isaac Newton, and many people believe that Sir Isaac Newton was a deist as well with his teachings, and basically believing that everything operates under the principle of natural law, that everything in the cosmos operates mathematically and can be proven with precision. So thus, there's no such thing as the miraculous. There's no such thing as the mysterious, because everything can be proven. We know this, and so if there's ever a short gap in our knowledge, if there's any area within our human knowledge where we don't have information readily at hand, the truth is that in time we'll understand it. And so thus there's nothing mysterious. We just need information. We need to be able to do the math. And so thus there's a heavy reliance upon the here and now, on reason, observation, thus a rejection against divine revelation or the mysterious. So a central premise to deism, basically, if we can put it in a nutshell, like I said, is rejects revelation as a source of knowledge, but really most deists actually would still attend church. They would attend church services. George Washington was a deist, and he advocaatly never missed a church service, one of his local churches, the Episcopal Church. He talked a lot about God, but yet he kind of believed in a non, didn't believe in the same type of God or the same type of Jesus that a typical fundamentalist Christian would believe in. He had a different sense of that because of this idea. And so the central premise of many of the deists was that religion had been corrupted, had ultimately been corrupted by priests who use religion as a tool of manipulation for personal gain or for class interest. Priests become elevated in society because they hold a special place. Those who are ministers, who are entrusted with religious teaching, are put are automatically put at a higher place or higher class within our society than possibly they should be at this time, because again, Europe was just plagued by all these religious wars and by religious corruption. And so this is where they saw the root. Religion as itself makes sense, but outside of the priesthood, it does make sense, but that religion had been corrupted, it had been promoted by irrational truths, by men who wanted to use it as a tool of manipulation. So that's why religion is very superstitious, why religion has mysteries, is because it forces you to have an unhealthy reliance upon somebody else for truth and knowledge, when that shouldn't be the case. And so thus many deists, they were on the mission to strip away what they would known as the priestcraft or the mysteries. And so people like Thomas Jefferson, even though um, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin are kind of the key figureheads of the deist movement within America. At least Thomas Jefferson, he was an avid writer of religion. He studied religion a lot. But when you read his writings, he saw it as, again, it was his attempt to strip away the priestcraft, what he would call it, the mysteries of the Bible, and distill it down to actual facts and promotions, and see that the religion that Christ was talking about was more of an ethical and moral philosophy in Thomas Jefferson's way of teaching. And so that's why you can see how Thomas Jefferson can be reactant to religion and advocate for the freedom of religion and from religion, because he saw it as at times putting people down. And so, yes, more back to the central premise is that they believe that original religion, these religion primitive and past societies, were less encrusted by the priestcraft. And so thus many of these primitive and past societies, like the Greek philosophers or even the Native Americans, were actually closer to the original truth, closer to this natural theology of the way the world works. And so typically they were idealized and looked towards because, again, they were trying to get away from the Catholic Church and its heavily priestly idea. And so, like we said, many deists greatly influenced American religious politics. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, John Adams, George Washington. They were deists to some forms and some elements, but as well as kept much of their Christian roots. For sure, or George Washington, John Adams, and Madison kept more of their traditional Christian roots, but they still were advocately deist. But later, deism fell away here in America and would later turn into Unitarianism. And we won't talk about Unitarianism, but that is one of the projects that you guys can write about Unitarianism here in America. All right, so now let's get to the revolution. So religion in the American Revolution. So while the American Revolution had its political, what we call casus belli, which is Latin for cause for war, there were several political causes of war. What's often forgotten is that there was many religious influences as well that led to causes for war in America. So a lot of people will say that there was this religious ideology surrounding freedom. So freedom was, for America was seen, for many average Americans, was not given this kind of prior to the French and Indian Revolution or War and the American Revolution. Freedom was seen as, very limited. But then later, ideas about freedom and liberty became overtoned with religious ideology. I don't know if I really buy that, but that's what a lot of American scholars and religious scholars would say, that we have this change of how freedom was talked about. But I will say that freedom was, here in America, our ideas of liberty were often spewed from the pulpit rather than spewed in the public square. And so many where people got their ideas and got their stories and got their sentiments and their ideology about liberty and why America should be free from tyranny, was that it came from the pulpits instead. So you have this again, the shift from a simple love of freedom of why they're coming to America to now that we need to fight and maintain our spirit of liberty. Excuse me. So also, many Protestant churches, the polity was completely different in America versus than where it was in England. And so many, again, of the dissenters, being the Puritans and the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Methodists, were all, in their style of church government, were all Republican in nature or Democratic in nature. Many of the Baptists and Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians were accused in Europe of being anti-monarchical because, again, people recognized that their style of government, they tended to favor more Republican style of government in politics because of their church practices. And so you see that here in America as well, that once the American Revolution began, many of the patriots were in fact Baptists, Methodists, Lutherans, surprisingly some Catholics as well. Those who stayed on the loyalist side, those who stayed in favor of England, typically tended to be more Anglican in their style of worship because, again, Anglicans, the head of the church, is the monarch. And it was a hierarchical system where there was a single figurehead. Where in the Presbyterian church, the Baptists, and the Methodists, that doesn't exist. It's more localized in its leadership. So you can see again from how the churches were formed in America and operated, it promoted more and more revolutionary ideas. And there was also a fear of Anglican expansionism, and then later fear of Anglican abuses that occurred in America. Because again, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was equivalent to the British monarchy. And so after the French and Indian War, when the British were able to seize all of Canada from the French, there was this great fear that now the British had a stronger foothold in the American colonies and were thus going to subjugate the American colonies even more so. And it started to happen even prior to the French and Indian War with the Society for the Gospel, the propagation of the gospel that was established in England in 1701, but later made its way into the United States with the Hanover kings, King George the First, all the way till we get to George the Third, that he would use this society, this Anglican society, as a puppet in order to make sure and establish Anglican style control. And so this was very prominent in New York and in New Jersey and in Boston or Massachusetts area as well. And so this is why many of the Revolutionary Wars were all battles were fought in Massachusetts and New England and New Jersey area for a very long time because of this battle where the state governments or the colonial governments at the time wanted to put down or put down many of the other forms of Protestant faith in America. They wanted to establish and kind of institutionalize the Anglican Church in these areas, and how they would do that was through missionary activities known as the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, that they would send out missionaries, and these missionaries only had to come from England, that they couldn't come from the American colonies, and thus many of these missionaries tended to promote strict loyalty to the British Crown versus the American colonies. So it caused a lot of fear and anxiety because Americans were starting to see this expansionism bring out in America. Excuse me. So the last probably big part was a series of religious laws that were passed in England that subsequently made their way to America as well. And so we've already talked about one of these being the Test Act in 1673. And basically, just for quick remembrance and recall here, the Test Act basically said that all people who were government officials who wanted to work for the government, whether in the military or in parliament or the localized level, or if they're running for elections, whatnot, that they had to prove themselves to be Protestants, that they had to take a religious test, so to speak, in order to prove that they were Protestants, and that the religious tests were aimed at preventing dissenter Protestant groups as well as Catholics from serving in the government in England. That would eventually trickle its way down into many of the American colonies. The Carolinas, for example, later in New York as well. And so there were some areas where this would be trickled down. The next being the Vestry Act of 1701, that really made its way into North Carolina, or to the, well, both Carolinas, but more specifically North Carolina, that fought its resistance for a while. But basically, it passed in England where all taxes went to support the Anglican Church, and and that it paid its ministers, that it paid for church buildings, church maintenance, or the construction of new church buildings in America as well, and that all later also the Vestry Act also said that all political delegates as well as religious delegates to certain conferences had to swear allegiance to the crown at every single meeting. So again, it forced religious loyalty as well as political loyalty, taxes going to only support the Anglican Church, and so it was resisted heavily in America, but it was passed in North Carolina, and for a long time before, for a while. There's also the Occasional Conformity Act of 1711 that all members of Parliament had to be members of the Anglican Church and that they had routinely had to take communion from an Anglican bishop. And so that would eventually trickle itself down to America, where, again, you didn't have to be members of an Anglican church, but you had to take communion from an Anglican bishop during sessions of government. So you can see again why the American Revolution and the First Amendment was written in the way it was. Then later on, the Schism Act in 1714, that all teachers or tutors, private and public teachers and tutors, must be approved and licensed by the local bishop. In England, and then subsequently that made its way into New York, New Jersey, and parts of Pennsylvania as well. So thus to prevent, because a lot of the private tutors ended up being, Baptist ministers or Presbyterian ministers or Quaker ministers, and so thus, people would get these private lessons, and thus, some of the religious ideology would fade into these services, and so this was a way to curb education. And then finally, probably the last straw towards the revolution was the Quebec Act of 1774, which prevented non-Catholics from settling beyond the Appalachia mountain ranges. So thus, in order to appease the French colonists who still resided in much of the territories that the British had won from the French and Indian War, the Quebec Act served to protect and keep the peace among the French Catholics, but it was fearful because, again, it forbade all Protestants from settling in regions beyond the Appalachian Mountains in America. And so many Americans took this as an affront to their faith. So eventually, not all, but I mean, well, no, I shouldn't say eventually, but it should be noted that not all churches nor entire denominations supported the revolution, and that their support in denominations really varied. And so, even though it's safe to say, like I had up here, number two, that most Anglicans tended to be loyalists, for example, in South Carolina, the opposite was true, meaning Anglicans in South Carolina were actually very much fighters and patriots, but versus up in New York and in Pennsylvania, the opposite was true. They tended to be more loyal to the Anglican Church. And then, again, some Baptists, well, most Baptists were all patriots, but some Presbyterians weren't. And so in New Jersey and in um, Massachusetts area, well, no, mostly New Jersey and North Carolina regions, there were some who remained loyal to the crown versus being patriots. So it wasn't always true. So it made it very difficult, and why there'll be later splits within why here in America we don't have the Anglican Church anymore. We have the Episcopal Church because of the split that happened. And then two, some of the clergy did play a vital role in the Revolutionary War. And so there's one famous example that we know only from British records about this. We don't know much about the person. But again, British records during the Revolutionary Era would typically talk about Mr. Otis. So we really don't know who he was, but instead there's some books about who people think he was, but they would talk about Mr. Otis, who actually became, I think it's Samuel Otis, who is theorized, but he was a local minister in I think in the New England area, and that he would have a regiment of ministers that um, he had organized, and that they would go to camps, from cities to cities, villages to villages, to minister to the local people. But in turn, what they were actually doing, besides ministering, they were actually promulgating the Revolutionary War. They were looking for recruits. They were going out preaching the message of the American Revolution War, why you should fight for it, why should you take up the cause, and being recruiting tools. And so many of these ministers did play this role as being recruiters for the role and for the war. And we also know several clergymen who did take up arms and fought in various regiments as well, and served on the lines as well. But then, too, shortly after or really during the Revolutionary War, many of the colonial governments took the chance and the opportunity during the war to really disestablish certain denominations from having dominance in certain areas. So, for example, New York at this time took it upon themselves during the Revolutionary War to de-establish the Anglican Church. And then you had Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, North Carolina, that their colonial governments as well passed free exercise clauses or free exercise amendments during the Revolutionary War. So it's very interesting that why they're promoting freedom of religion during this time, because again, back to some of these causes here of what was going on. All right. So now let's talk about, we talked about religion in the American Revolution, that it did play a certain role and a certain part. Let's talk about the role that religion played in forming our republic. So really, for our instances, it's the push for the First Amendment. So following the draft of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, many people felt that it had failed in solving the debate over religious freedom, because the Constitution at the time only had one statement at its first drafting. Article 6 here, Clause 3, that the only statement that the U.S. Constitution has about religion outside of the Bill of Rights was this, that no religious test shall ever be required. So you had a fierce debate that raged on within the Constitutional Convention. People like George Mason, who felt that the federal government needs power, needs to have specific statements within the Constitution that gives it the ability to enforce certain civil rights. And so you had a clause like this that said no religious test shall be required, but it doesn't say, according to Mason, that it's freedom of religion. James Madison, however, thought that this is sufficient enough. So that state laws are sufficient enough. This is where it should be done on the local level. And that if the Constitution makes specific claims, then the specific claims that it doesn't mention, that means that they are permitted. So, for an example, the 14th Amendment, gives individuals freedom, but it, uses the language of men. Men have the freedom, due to the 14th Amendment. And then, the Declaration of Independence speaks of men having freedom and certain unalienable rights. It doesn't mention women. And so some people would say, well, since it doesn't mention women, therefore women do not have rights. But then, somebody like James Madison would say, well, it's just assumed. Men is to be taken universal. Therefore, women have specific rights. But however, some would say, on the other side of James Madison's argument, that since it's not mentioned specifically, or like George Mason has, where it's not mentioned specifically, therefore, there's the assumption that women have no rights. Therefore, we need specific clarifications. So you had this debate between two of our great founding fathers, George Mason, who argued that the federal government needs to be specific. It needs to list out specific rights, where James Madison said, no, the federal government doesn't need to, because the states are sufficient enough, that they should be in charge, that we don't have to worry with it. Later, we'll see that being a problem when it comes to abolition, where James Madison is proven wrong, that state laws are not sufficient enough, and thus federal government needs to take control. So many states would not ratify the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, because there was no Bill of Rights. And more specifically, some of the states also argued because there was no religious liberty in the U.S. Constitution. There was only one statement, about no religious test shall ever be passed required, and this is in terms of those who are serving political office, that you don't have to be a Christian to be the president of the United States. This was something that during the Barack Obama's election, why some people were saying, oh, Obama is this Muslim, and why many people were trying to defend, because they were pointing back, well, wait a minute, it doesn't matter if he's a Muslim, because our U.S. Constitution says no religious tests should be ever required on somebody. Thus, you should never consider religion to be a category in someone determining if they're good enough to be president or not. So you had those kind of debates that were going on, and they still go on to this day. It even happened with Mitt Romney when he was running against Obama, because Mitt Romney was a Mormon, and so there were some people saying, aha, he's a Mormon, therefore he can't be president, or he can't be because of he's going to be more loyal to his Mormon faith than he is to the U.S. Constitution. But that's not what the U.S. Constitution says. So you can see again why we need specifics. Because again, in later debates, we disregard what the Constitution says. But again, many states would not ratify the Constitution unless there's a Bill of Rights and unless there's religious freedom and liberty guaranteed within it. Because there were certain examples that had gone on that proved that state governments can't be sufficient within themselves. So the most famous example comes from 1784, right after 2 or 3 years after the end of the Revolutionary War. The Anglicans, who had dominated Virginia State Assembly and were continuing to fight for establishment, that they asked for levying power to have taxes on people to support the Anglican Church. And so this is an area where James Madison's argument is being defeated within his own state. James Madison was from Virginia. And he was saying, state laws are sufficient enough that we don't need to list these rules. We don't need to list these rights of freedom of religion. Well, Mason, who also is from Virginia too, is saying, no, we do need it, because look at here. Here's a prime example that our own state is defying its rules and forcing religion upon other people. And so you had in Virginia both Baptists and some Presbyterians, but primarily Baptists, pressuring state leaders that we need to have freedom of religion. And so that's Thomas Jefferson and James Madison come together and they write the most, which is one of Thomas Jefferson's most famous documents. On his tombstone, it's listed this document that he's so proud of writing. Created the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1786. And so it was that document that became the backbone for the First Amendment and why we need it and why we need to have it. So, what does the First Amendment say about religion? So, famously, the First Amendment says, quote, Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or prohibit the fair exercise thereof. So, within the First Amendment of the Constitution, there are two specific clauses that talk about the establishment or talk about religion. The first being the Establishment Clause. That means Congress shall make no law establishing a religion. And so what does that mean? It prohibits the federal government from creating a national church or exclusively getting involved in religion, thus a separation of the institutions, not a separation of religion and politics. I wish there was a separation of religion and politics. I most so desperately wish there was, but that's not a reality. And so thus you have religion and politics always being involved, always getting along, always intertwined with each other. But however, thankfully, there's supposed to be the separation of institutions. The federal government is not supposed to get involved with religious matters, not supposed to protect one religion over another. It is to remain neutral. And we're also not to have a national church. We're not to have citizens of America are not supposed to believe in one faith or another. So there's debates of whether, on the back of our money, in God we trust, is that a violation of the Establishment Clause or not? You can debate that, guys, later, but, it's interesting, again, because this is what the Establishment Clause is supposed to be. It prohibits the federal government from creating a national church or creating a national belief. The free exercise clause. Free exercise grants freedom of religious beliefs, but it does not grant the freedom of religious practices. And so a prime example of this is when if any of you guys are interested, part of many of the U.S. Constitution or the U.S. Supreme Court battles over religion, the most famous one being U.S. versus Reynolds in 1879, where United States had outlawed polygamy, but yet you have a Mormon in Reynolds suing the federal government saying that you are violating the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, that you're to grant my freedom of religious beliefs, and I believe in polygamy. However, the Supreme Court during U.S. versus Reynolds cited that no, the free exercise clause only grants the freedom to believe of religious freedom, that you can believe whatever the hell you want to believe, but you do not have the freedom to practice whatever the hell you want to believe. So if your religion, for example, believes in child sacrifices, here in the United States, you do not have the right to sacrifice a child. You don't. The federal government is not going to protect you. And so thus, it's who said it? Justice John Marshall, I believe it was, who said it. They said freedom, freedom here in America is defined by the right to swing my fist wherever I want to, except my freedom stops where your nose begins, because it infringes upon your freedom and your right. So again, religious freedom, you can believe whatever the hell you want, but you cannot practice whatever you want. But also the free exercise clause, and Jefferson was adamant about this, and this is why we know, and Madison to an extent too. The free exercise clause also prohibits that you can believe whatever, that you don't have to believe in religion. That atheism is protected here in the United States. So again, free exercise clause. However, some states, back to Madison's argument that state laws are sufficient enough, some states were very slow against the Establishment Clause. So you had all the way up until Connecticut in 1818, New Hampshire 1819, Massachusetts 1833 were the last states to de-establish religion. So these states were breaking the law, but we're not being punished because, again, how it's written, the federal government prohibits the creating of a national state or a national religion. But back to Madison's argument, states' laws are sufficient enough. The state laws did establish religions, did have an established religion in these in our United States, and so all the way up until 1833, in the state of Massachusetts, you had to believe, or your money, your taxes went to pay for the congregational denomination. So again, very, very late coming, but this is where the First Amendment comes from. And again, it comes, and you can see where our roots go all the way back to that of, the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, the infighting between Parliament and the monarchy, Protestants versus Catholics in Europe. So much of our institutions were fought and created against in reaction to these movements. So the last thing that I want to talk about, I know we've talked about a lot in this class, but the last thing I want to talk about is America's greatest contribution to religion. So very quickly, because America is not a monolithic state, it's 13 states. It's now 50 states within the Union of the United States. Therefore, it does not have a monolithic church. There's not one singular church. There's not one Church of America like there is a Church of Canada, like there's a Church of England, a Church of Germany, a Church of Scotland, a Church of Ireland. We do not have a Church of America. Instead, what we have is we have a multiplicity of governments, state, federal, local governments, all working in unison together. And thus we have a multiplicity of churches that creates unity and in diversity, united by common beliefs and common law. So, if religious affiliation was voluntary now in America, and if individuals and groups could have final authority over belief and practices, then what America's greatest contribution to religion is, now America put religion in the free market to survive. That's America's greatest contribution to religion. Instead of being it state-sponsored, state-controlled, state-survived, now religion is put out to the free market, and thus religion is forced to compete. Religion in America are forced to compete with one another in order to persuade individuals to believe in them, to support them, and to finance them. And so if a religion dies out, it is meant here in America that that religion was not seen as viable or not seen as legitimate. So why certain denominations are falling and dying out? Because Americans don't see them as legitimate anymore, or as viable, or as containing truth, or are containing principles anymore. And so thus, the state has no say over religion, and thus it is the free market, it's the people that have the say. So greatly democratized religion. But however, because the United States placed religion in the free market, it opened religion to an unpredicated explosion, an unpredictable explosion of religious experimentation in America. And that's why we really study religion in America, is because America is so freaking different. And why we're going to talk about a lot of different waves of new religious movements emerging over and over and over again. And why you're saying, why is there such a thing as Scientology? Why is that not outlawed? When you see the, beliefs, or you see the interviews being done by ex-Scientologist members, and they talk about the persecutions, they talk about the brainwashing and everything. Why do we have cults? Why does our government allow cults? Because we allow for it to exist in a free market. We hope and expect the free market will decide what survives and what doesn't. And so far, the free market has been true. Many of the cults, many of the new denominational movements that have emerged quickly do die out because the free market ultimately depicts, what survives and what doesn't. So to me, this is one of America's greatest contributions to religion. But again, because of that, because religion is forced to compete out in the open, you have various ways of religious experimentation going on that doesn't happen anywhere else in Europe. Because for so long in Europe, really until the 20th century, the the churches were still being state sponsored, state controlled. So thus there didn't allow for religious experimentations. And thus, here in America, why something like Mormonism, Shakerism, the United Community, Millerites, Scientology, Jehovah's Witness, all of them can emerge only here in America because of free market and because of religious experimentation.